She was just a maid, a girl with a voice, like a melody and a past she couldn't escape. He was a billionaire, a man who took what he wanted. One night she sang, and he claimed her, but was it love, or a beautiful golden cage? The night mansion was a world of its own, vast, luxurious, and eerily silent when the night fell. Rain drummed against the towering windows, lightning briefly illuminating the opulent decor inside. The chandeliers above glowed with a golden hue, casting long, elegant shadows over the marble floors. Yet, despite all the grandeur, there was a lingering emptiness in the air, like a palace without a soul. Amidst this hollow luxury moved Zara Evans, the quiet, unseen presence in the billionaire's world. She was just a maid, one of many who kept the estate running flawlessly. But unlike the others, she never gossiped about the powerful man she worked for. She never tried to catch his attention, nor did she linger where she wasn't needed. Damien Knight, the ruthless billionaire, had no time for distractions. His world revolved around business, power, and wealth. Yet, something about him fascinated Zara, not because of his unimaginable riches, but because beneath his sharp suits and cold demeanor, there was a strange kind of loneliness in his eyes. Tonight the mansion was nearly empty. Most of the staff had retired for the evening. Damien had returned late from a business deal, locked away in his study, whiskey in hand, like every night. Zara sighed as she finished her last task, wiping her damp hands on the apron tied around her waist. Her feet ached from hours of work, but instead of retreating to her small quarters, she wandered into the music room, a place rarely used anymore. It was breathtaking. A grand black piano sat in the center, its surface gleaming under the soft moonlight filtering through the arched windows. The walls were lined with bookshelves, old records, and forgotten music sheets. Her fingers hovered over the piano keys. Music had once been her world, a past life she had abandoned long ago. She took a shaky breath, closed her eyes, and without thinking, began to sing. A voice that broke the silence. The first note slipped from her lips, soft yet powerful, like a whisper of something lost. Her voice carried through the empty mansion, floating like a delicate secret. It wasn't just a song, it was raw emotion poured into melody. It spoke of longing, of heartbreak, of love that was once found, and then mercilessly stolen. It was the kind of song that made time stand still, that sent shivers down the spine. She thought she was alone. She was wrong. In the dimly lit corridor just outside, Damien Knight stood frozen. He had been passing through, intending to pour himself another drink when the sound stopped him in his tracks. His breath caught, something deep inside his chest twisted, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Her voice, it wasn't just beautiful, it was haunting. It reached inside him, pulling at something buried beneath the walls he had so carefully built. For the first time in a long time, he felt something. Who the hell was singing? Slowly he moved toward the music room, his heartbeat oddly uneven. His fingers curled around the doorframe as he stepped inside, and then he saw her. Zara, his maid, standing by the grand piano, her eyes closed, completely lost in the melody. She was stunning, not in the way models and actresses were, but in a way that made it impossible to look away. The dim glow of the chandelier cast a soft halo around her, her dark lashes brushing against her flushed cheeks. She had no idea she was being watched, but when the song ended and silence fell, she felt it, a presence. Her eyes snapped open, and there he was, Damien Knight, watching her. His blue eyes burned into hers, unreadable, intense. The air between them thickened. For a moment neither of them spoke, just silence, just tension, just an invisible thread tying them together. Her heart pounded. How long had he been standing there? You, her voice wavered. You shouldn't be here. Damien's lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. Neither should you. Zara swallowed hard. The way he was looking at her, it made her stomach flip, made her feel exposed, like he had seen a part of her she had tried to keep hidden. She took a step back, her pulse racing. She began, but the words died in her throat as Damien stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His gaze never left hers. Sing again. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Her breath hitched. I can't. Damien tilted his head slightly, studying her like a puzzle he was determined to solve. That's a lie, he murmured. Zara clenched her fists. Why do you care? A flicker of something passed through his expression, something she couldn't quite name. But when he spoke again, his voice was softer. Because that voice of yours doesn't belong in the shadows. Her chest tightened. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever truly seen her before. And yet here he was, Damien Knight, the cold, powerful billionaire, completely captivated. And in that moment, Zara's life changed forever. Zara stood frozen, her breath shallow, her heart hammering against her ribs. The way Damien Knight looked at her, it was dangerous, intense, unreadable. A man like him wasn't supposed to notice a woman like her. She was just the maid, the girl who scrubbed floors and stayed in the background. Yet in this moment, standing in the dimly lit music room, with her heart still singing from the melody she had poured her soul into, she felt exposed, seen in a way she had never been before, and he wasn't looking away. Damien took another slow step forward, his polished Italian shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. His gaze was sharp, piercing as if he was trying to read every secret buried inside her. Sing again, he repeated, his voice low, almost commanding. Zara swallowed hard, gripping the edges of her dress. Why did he care? I shouldn't have been here, she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. I should go. She turned to leave, but before she could take another step, Damien's voice stopped her. That voice of yours. His tone was quieter this time, softer but still filled with something powerful. It doesn't belong in the shadows. Zara's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. Don't listen to him. Don't believe the fantasy. She knew men like him, untouchable, cold, ruthless. Yet, there was something about the way he was looking at her now. Something raw, something real. She turned back to face him, her pulse still erratic. Why do you care, Mr. Knight? For a second, just a flicker of a second, his expression changed, like he was debating something. Then just as quickly, his usual unreadable mask returned. Instead of answering, he stepped forward, too close. Zara sucked in a breath, as his scent wrapped around her, whiskey, expensive cologne, and something purely him. His gaze flickered over her lips, just for a second, before locking back onto her eyes. Sing, he murmured again, this time almost like a whisper, as if her voice had awakened something in him that even he didn't understand. She shivered. This was dangerous. I don't sing anymore, she forced herself to say. Damien's jaw tightened, as if the answer bothered him. Why? Because my dreams were crushed. Because I was left with nothing. Because life isn't a fairy tale. She didn't say any of that. Instead she whispered, it doesn't matter. For the first time since she had known him, Damien looked frustrated, as if he wasn't used to people refusing him. You sang tonight, he pointed out, his voice like silk and steel. Why? Zara hesitated. Because I thought I was alone. Because for once I wanted to feel alive. Instead she whispered, because I forgot you were here. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of Damien's lips, but there was something else in his eyes, something dark and unreadable. Sing again, he said. She shook her head. No. His smirk vanished. A charged silence stretched between them. Then unexpectedly, Damien did something that made her stomach twist into knots. He moved to the piano. Zara blinked as he sat down on the sleek black bench, his long fingers grazing the ivory keys like a man who had touched them 1,000 times before. And then he began to play. The first notes echoed through the room, deep and powerful, sending chills down her spine. He was good, not just good, incredible. Zara's lips parted in shock. The cold, ruthless billionaire could play. She had never seen this side of him before. No one had. His fingers moved effortlessly over the keys, weaving a melody that was both haunting and breathtaking. A song of longing, of something unfinished, and then, he looked up at her. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers as he played, daring her, challenging her. The unspoken words hung between them. Sing, I know you want to. Zara's throat tightened. Dame him. Dame him for making her feel things she had no right to feel. Her fingers trembled at her sides. Every cell in her body screamed at her to walk away. But her heart, her foolish, fragile heart, betrayed her. She sang, softly at first, barely above a whisper. But Damien didn't stop playing. The music wrapped around her like a lover's embrace, and her voice grew stronger, breaking free from the chains she had put around it for so long. Damien's fingers never faltered, his gaze never wavered. It felt intimate, too intimate, like a secret meant for just the two of them. When the last note faded, silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Zara's chest rose and fell as she tried to catch her breath. What the hell just happened? Damien slowly stood, his movements deliberate. He closed the space between them, until he was so close, she could feel his heat, could see the slow, controlled rise and fall of his chest. Do you still think you shouldn't sing? He murmured. Zara's lips parted, but no sound came out. You felt it, didn't you? His voice was lower now, almost dangerous. The way music lives inside you, the way it was meant to be heard. She clenched her fists, trying to ignore the way her body reacted to his words, his presence. You don't know me, she whispered. You don't know anything about me. Damien's gaze flickered, a storm brewing in his eyes. Maybe not, he admitted, his voice rough. But I know one thing, Zara Evans. He leaned in just enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. Too close, too intoxicating. That voice of yours is going to change everything. Her breath hitched, and deep down, she knew he was right. The air between them was electric, thick with something dangerous, something intoxicating. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as she stared up at Damien Knight, the cold, ruthless billionaire, who had just shattered every carefully built wall around her, with nothing but a melody and a look. That voice of yours is going to change everything, he had whispered. She wished she could pretend it meant nothing, that she could step back, bow her head like a proper maid, and forget that this moment had ever happened. But she couldn't, because in Damien's eyes, she wasn't just a maid anymore, and that terrified her. Zara swallowed hard, taking a shaky step back. Distance. She needed distance. I should go, she stammered. But Damien Knight didn't move. His gaze stayed locked onto hers, intense and unreadable, and then his next words changed everything.
Stay.
Zara froze, her lips parted, her pulse racing. What? Damien took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance she had tried to create. I want you to stay, he repeated, his voice smooth as silk, but carrying a weight she couldn't ignore. A shiver ran down her spine. Why? His gaze flickered, as if debating how much he wanted to reveal. And then his answer came. Sing for me. Zara inhaled sharply.
No.
This wasn't happening. She shook her head. I can't. Damien arched a brow. You just did. That was a mistake. His smirk was slow, calculated. Was it? Zara's stomach twisted. He wasn't letting this go. You don't understand, she whispered. I left that part of me behind. I'm just a maid now. Damien's expression darkened, a storm brewing in those piercing blue eyes. Do you really believe that? He asked, his voice dangerously soft. That the woman who just stood here, singing with more soul than I've ever heard, was meant to spend her life scrubbing floors? Zara's breath caught, because no one had ever asked her that before. No one had ever challenged the life she had resigned herself to. She didn't realize Damien had stepped even closer, until she felt the warmth of his breath against her cheek. Come work for me, he murmured. Her eyes snapped up to his. I already work for you, not as a maid. Zara's heartbeat slammed against her ribs. Then as what? His gaze flickered to her lips. Just for a second, just enough to make her breath hitch. As a singer. Silence. Zara's mind went blank. I don't understand. Damien's smirk was slow, almost dangerous. I'm making a proposal, Zara. I want to sponsor you, fund your music, give you everything you need to bring that voice back to life. Her stomach twisted. Why would you do that? His expression turned unreadable again. Dark, mysterious, intriguing. Because I know talent when I hear it, he said simply. And because I never do anything half-heartedly. Oh. If I want something, I make sure I get it. A shiver ran down Zara's spine. There it was, the raw, undeniable power of Damien Knight. She was just a maid, and yet in his eyes, she was something more, something he wanted, and that terrified her more than anything. She shook her head. I can't accept that. Damien's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people telling him no. Why not? His voice was low, measured. Because you don't believe in yourself, or because you don't trust me. Zara's throat tightened. Both. She didn't say it out loud, but Damien saw right through her. His lips curved into something smaller this time, almost sad. Someone hurt you, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Someone took that fire away from you. Zara felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't felt in years. I should go, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment she thought Damien would stop her again. But he didn't. He just watched her, like a man who had just found something he wasn't willing to lose. Think about my offer, Zara, he said softly. Because this isn't the end of our story. It's just the beginning. Zara turned and walked away. But her heart stayed with him. And she knew deep down, no matter how much she tried to fight it, Damien Knight was about to change her life forever. Zara's mind was a battlefield of emotions, as she lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling. Damien Knight's voice still echoed in her ears. Come work for me, not as a maid, as a singer. Her heart clenched. It wasn't just the proposal. It was the way he looked at her, as if he had already decided her fate, as if saying no was never really an option. A shiver ran down her spine. Damien Knight was dangerous, not in the way of criminals or villains, but in the way that a man like him, powerful, intoxicating, all-consuming, could turn her world upside down without even trying. And the scariest part, she wanted it. But wanting something and having it were two different things. Zara had been burned before. She knew what happened when you trusted the wrong man. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, Zara tried to act normal, tried to blend into the background like she always did. But nothing felt normal anymore. Not when she entered the grand dining room to serve breakfast, and felt Damien's gaze burn into her from across the table. Not when their eyes met for the briefest second before she quickly looked away, her hands trembling as she poured his coffee, and certainly not when he leaned in slightly, just enough that his voice sent a shiver down her spine. Have you thought about my offer? Zara's breath hitched. She kept her eyes on the cup in front of her, refusing to meet his gaze. I don't think it's a good idea, she whispered. Damien's jaw tightened. Why not? Because men like you don't do things out of kindness, she said softly. A dangerous smirk touched his lips. You think I have an ulterior motive? Her stomach twisted. Don't you? For a second something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair, watching her with amusement. You intrigue me, Zara. She swallowed hard. And that's not a good thing, she whispered. Damien's smirk deepened. That depends on what you do next. For the next few days, Zara did everything she could to avoid him. She took extra shifts in the kitchen. She worked late into the night. She buried herself in chores that had nothing to do with him. But Damien Knight wasn't a man who was easily ignored. He found her in the garden one afternoon, where she was tending to the roses near the fountain. The scent of fresh blooms filled the air, but it was his presence that made her dizzy. You're avoiding me, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Zara wiped her hands on her apron. I have work to do. Damien stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. I won't ask again, Zara. She tensed. Ask what? His lips curved into something dark. something underneath to sing for me. The world seemed to still. Zara's breath came in short, shallow gasps. She wanted to say no. She needed to say no. But then Damien did something unexpected. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Zara's body went rigid at the warmth of his fingers against her skin. His touch was gentle, almost intimate. Too intimate. "Let me give you everything you deserve," he murmured. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She started, but her voice betrayed her. Damien's gaze darkened. His fingers lingered just a second too long before he finally pulled away. "You think I'm dangerous, don't you?" he mused, tilting his head slightly. Zara swallowed hard. "Aren't you?" His smirk was slow, deliberate. "Only if you want me to be." Heat pooled in her stomach. This was a game. A dangerous, dangerous game. And she was losing. "Think about my offer," he said softly. "But don't take too long." Zara didn't ask why. Because the way Damien looked at her now, like he had already decided she was his, she knew exactly what he meant. That night, Zara lay in bed, her heart racing. She had spent years trying to forget her past, trying to silence the music inside her. But Damien had awakened something she thought was dead. A spark, a hunger, a dream. And the scariest part, she wasn't sure she wanted to fight it anymore. The night air was thick with tension. Zara stood on the grand balcony of Damien Knight's mansion, her hands gripping the cool marble railing. The city skyline stretched before her, glittering under the moonlight. But her mind was miles away, trapped in a storm she couldn't escape. Damien's voice still echoed in her head. "Let me give you everything you deserve." His words had unsettled her, shaken her in ways she wasn't ready to admit. Because a man like Damien Knight didn't make empty promises. And if she said yes, if she let herself step into his world, she would never be the same again.
Ear.
A soft breeze swept through the night, sending a shiver down her spine. Then a presence. She felt it before she even turned around. Heat, strength, power. Damien. Her breath caught as she slowly turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse race. For a moment neither of them spoke. The night wrapped around them, thick with unspoken words, unfulfilled desires. Then finally Damien stepped closer. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he murmured. Zara exhaled shakily, forcing a smile. "I needed air." His gaze never wavered, running away from something. Her stomach twisted. Was she that easy to read? She looked away, focusing on the city lights. "I just needed to think." Damien leaned against the railing, just inches away from her. The warmth of his body so close sent a wave of and his voice was low, deep, dangerous. Zara hesitated. "And I don't know what to do." Damien's gaze softened slightly. "You're afraid." Her fingers tightened around the railing.
Oh, wouldn't you be?
Silence, then a confession. "I don't know how to be afraid," Damien said quietly. Zara turned to him, surprised. "Everyone is afraid of something."
E.
Before of brood, if of brood, if of brood. Damien held her gaze, and for the first time she saw something raw beneath the surface. "Not me," he said.
E.
Not anymore. Her heart clenched. What had the world done to him to make him this way? She should have pulled away. But she didn't. Instead she found herself whispering, "And what if I say no?" Damien's lips curved into something dark, unreadable. "Then I'll have to change your mind." Her breath hitched, and then he reached for her. His fingers brushed against her wrist, a feather-light touch that sent fire through her veins. "Zara," he murmured. The way he said her name, it was intoxicating. Zara's body betrayed her. She didn't move away, didn't push him back. Because in that moment, with the city lights shimmering behind them, and the air thick with undeniable tension, there was no denying the truth. She wanted him. And Damien knew it. "You can keep pretending all you want," he whispered, his lips dangerously close to her ear.
But we both know what's happening here.
A shiver ran down her spine. "Damien, say it."
His voice was a command. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "What do you want me to say?" she whispered. His hand slid up, trailing from her wrist to her forearm, his touch burning into her skin. "Say you feel it too," he murmured. Zara closed her eyes, fighting the storm inside her, because she did feel it. She had always felt it. From the first moment she met him. From the moment he looked at her like she was more than just a maid. But saying it out loud meant giving in. And if she gave in to Damien,
Iba.
she wasn't sure she'd ever find her way back. The night felt like it had a heartbeat of its own.
Oh.
Every sound, the rustling of the wind, the distant hum of the city, faded into nothing, as Damien stood impossibly close to Zara, his gaze dark, unreadable, but completely consuming. She could feel the tension between them like a living thing. It crackled in the air, heavy, intoxicating. His fingers still lingered against her skin, tracing slow, deliberate patterns up her arm. A silent question, a dangerous temptation. "Say it, Zara," he murmured, his voice a husky whisper against the night. Zara's breath shuddered out of her. "Say what?" Damien's lips curved, not quite a smirk, not quite a smile. "Something else, something deeper, that you feel it too." Her heart slammed against her ribs, because how could she deny it? Every inch of her body was betraying her, leaning into his touch, craving the warmth of his presence. But this wasn't just attraction, it was something far more dangerous, something that could ruin her. Zara squeezed her eyes shut, fighting for control. This isn't right," she whispered. Damien tilted his head, watching her carefully. "What are you afraid of?" Her stomach twisted. Everything. Afraid of how easily he could make her forget herself. Afraid of the way he saw through her every wall, every carefully constructed defense. Afraid of how much she wanted this. "You," she admitted softly. For the first time something flickered in Damien's eyes, something vulnerable. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she didn't. His fingertips brushed along her jaw, tilting her face up toward his. The city lights cast shadows across his features, making him look even more dangerous, even more beautiful. "Zara," he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. She should have run. She should have said no.
But when he leaned in, when his lips hovered just inches from hers, her body made the choice for her. She exhaled shakily, her breath mixing with his. Damien didn't rush. He waited, giving her the chance to stop this, to walk away. But she didn't. She couldn't. Because in that moment, everything else disappeared. And then he kissed her. It was slow, deep, devastating. Not gentle, not careful. It was the kind of kiss that demanded surrender, that stole the air from her lungs, the ground from beneath her feet. Zara gasped softly against his lips, her fingers gripping his shirt, as if holding on to reality itself. Damien growled low in his throat, his hands sliding down her waist, pulling her closer, deeper into him. And Zara, she let herself drown, because this moment, this fire, this impossible, undeniable connection was unlike anything she had ever known. Damien kissed, like a man who never did anything halfway, like a man who took what he wanted, and right now, he wanted her. Zara didn't know how long they stood there, lost in each other. Seconds, minutes, a lifetime. All she knew was that when he finally pulled away, when he rested his forehead against hers, she was ruined. She was his. And that terrified her more than anything. "Tell me to stop," Damien whispered against her lips, his breath hot, ragged. Zara opened her mouth, but no words came, because how could she tell him to stop, when stopping was the last thing she wanted? The kiss had shattered everything Zara thought she knew. There were no more boundaries, no more pretenses, only the fire burning between them, consuming them whole. Her fingers were still curled into Damien's shirt, her body still pressed against his, as if she were afraid that if she let go, reality would come crashing down. And maybe it would, because this wasn't supposed to happen. She was just a maid. He was Damien Knight, a billionaire, a man who could have anyone he wanted. So why Why did he kiss her like she was the only woman in the world? Zara, his voice was low, rough, filled with something she couldn't quite decipher. She forced herself to look up, to meet his gaze, and immediately regretted it, because his eyes, they held a storm, dark, possessive, hungry. Her breath hitched as his fingers traced slow, teasing patterns along the small of her back, sending shivers through her entire body. You should go, he murmured, though the way his hands gripped her waist said the opposite. Zara's lips parted. She should turn around and walk away, before she made a mistake she could never take back. But something inside her, something reckless, something she had buried for so long, didn't want to go. Tell me you don't want this, Damien whispered, his forehead resting against hers, and I swear, I'll let you go. Zara's heart slammed against her ribs. He was giving her a choice, a way out. All she had to do was say it. Tell him she didn't want him. Tell him this was wrong. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came, because it would be a lie, and Damien knew it. A slow, knowing smirk curved his lips as he tilted her chin up, his thumb brushing against her bottom lip, in a way that made her knees weak. You can't, can you? He murmured. Zara's breath trembled. Damien, her voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough, because in the next second, he was kissing her again. This time, there was no hesitation, no waiting, just heat, just fire, just Damien. His hands slid down her back, gripping her hips, pulling her closer, until there was no space left between them. Zara gasped against his lips, her body arching into his, as his kisses trailed lower, along her jaw, down her neck. Damien, she moaned, her fingers tangling in his hair. He groaned at the sound, pressing her against the balcony railing, his lips worshipping every inch of her skin. Do you have any idea what you do to me? He growled against her collarbone. Zara shuddered, because she felt it. The way his body tensed against hers, the way his grip tightened, as if letting go wasn't an option. She wasn't just some passing distraction to him, and that scared her more than anything. Because what would happen, when the night ended, when reality crashed down on them? Zara's hands trembled as she cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. We shouldn't, she whispered, her voice betraying her. Damien's eyes darkened. Do you want me to stop? Zara's lips parted, but the answer never came, because she didn't know anymore. She didn't know what was right or wrong. She only knew that in this moment, in Damien's arms, she wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, she felt alive, and maybe, just maybe, she wasn't ready to let that go. The night had unraveled them. Zara stood in the dim glow of Damien's penthouse, her pulse racing, her skin still tingling from his touch. Her entire body felt branded by him, claimed by him. But reality had started creeping back in, whispering warnings she didn't want to hear. This was wrong, wasn't it? But when she looked up, Damien was watching her, with that same dark intensity that had pulled her under in the first place. And suddenly, she wasn't so sure. Damien stepped toward her, slow and deliberate, his movements laced with an unmistakable hunger. His shirt was slightly unbuttoned, his hair tousled from where her fingers had tangled in it. He looked utterly undone, because of her. Why are you shaking? His voice was deep, husky. Zara swallowed hard. Because I don't know what happens after this. Damien tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. You think this is just for tonight, he murmured, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. Her breath hitched at the tenderness in his touch, the contrast to the burning passion from moments ago. It's not, she whispered. Damien's jaw clenched, his fingers trailed down her neck, featherlight, but the look in his eyes was anything but soft. You have no idea, do you? He murmured. Zara's brows furrowed. About what? His hands slid lower, resting against the small of her back, pulling her just close enough to feel the warmth of his body. That once I have something I want. His voice dropped, sending a shiver down her spine. I don't let go. Her breath caught. Something in the way he said it made her heart race, not just with excitement, but with something dangerously close to fear. Damien, tell me you don't feel it, he interrupted.
his thumb brushing against her lips. Zara's mind screamed at her to step back, to run, to break free before she was in too deep. But her heart had already betrayed her. Damien's lips curled into a knowing smirk, as he took her silence as the answer it was. "You're mine now, Zara," he murmured. Something about the way he said it sent heat flooding through her veins, and chills running down her spine. Mine. The word felt like a vow, a promise, a warning, and for the first time, she wondered, what had she just gotten herself into? The air between them was thick, too thick. Zara's heart pounded against her ribs, as Damien's words echoed in her mind. "You're mine now." There was something dangerous in the way he said it, something that sent both fire and fear through her veins. She should have said something. She should have pushed him away, should have broken free before she fell any deeper. But she didn't, because a part of her, a foolish, reckless part, wanted to be his, even if it meant walking into the unknown, even if it meant risking everything. But at what cost? The next morning, Zara woke up tangled in the silk sheets of Damien's bed, her body still humming from the night before. The memories were too vivid, too raw. The way he had whispered her name like a prayer, the way his hands had worshipped her, claimed her. But reality came crashing down the moment she turned and found the space beside her empty. He was gone. For a moment something sharp twisted in her chest. Had she made a mistake? Had she just been another one of Damien Knight's conquests? She barely had time to process the thought when the door swung open, and there he was. Damien stood in the doorway, shirtless, his sculpted frame bathed in the soft morning light. His hair was tousled, his eyes darker than she remembered, and in his hand, a tray of breakfast. Zara blinked in surprise. "You brought me breakfast," Damien smirked, setting the tray down beside her, before climbing onto the bed. "I didn't want you to leave before I woke up," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her breath hitched. This wasn't what she expected. Not from him. Damien Knight, the ruthless billionaire, the man feared by his enemies, was looking at her like she was his entire world. It should have made her feel safe. But instead, it felt like a trap. "Damien," she swallowed hard. "What are we doing?" He didn't even hesitate. "Whatever we want." Zara shook her head. "You don't do relationships." Damien's expression darkened. "Maybe I just never met the right person." Her heart stopped. The weight of his words pressed against her, heavy, suffocating. Because this wasn't just attraction anymore. This was something dangerous, something that felt too much like forever. Damien reached for her, his fingers tracing slow, possessive circles along her wrist. "You're not leaving," he said quietly, his voice laced with something unbreakable. Zara's stomach twisted. "Damien, I don't." His grip tightened ever so slightly. "Don't run from me." Her throat went dry, because suddenly she realized this wasn't just passion anymore. This was obsession, and she wasn't sure if she would ever be able to escape. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Zara's pulse pounded in her ears, as Damien's fingers brushed against her wrist, not forcefully, but with quiet possession. It wasn't just the way he touched her, it was the way he looked at her, like he would never let go, like she was his. Her heart stuttered. "I should go," she whispered, though the words felt like a betrayal to everything she felt inside. Damien didn't move. He didn't let go. Instead, he tilted his head, watching her like he was memorizing every single detail of her. "Where would you go, Zara?" His voice was smooth, deep, dangerously hypnotic. Her throat tightened. "Back to my room." A ghost of a smirk curved his lips, but there was no amusement in his eyes. "You think you can just go back?" he murmured, his thumb brushing against her palm, sending shivers down her spine. Zara's breath caught. Because no, she couldn't pretend last night hadn't happened. Couldn't pretend she hadn't let herself fall. She couldn't go back to being just his maid. Not after everything. Not after him. Her silence only seemed to feed something primal inside Damien. In one swift move, he closed the space between them, his hands cupping her face, his gaze burning into her soul. "You belong here," he whispered. Zara's breath trembled. "Damien, this is too much." His grip on her tightened, just enough for her to feel it, just enough to send a warning. Too much. His lips ghosted over hers, teasing, torturing. Then why aren't you pulling away? Her entire body betrayed her, because she wasn't. She was leaning in, she was drowning, and Damien knew it. Tell me you don't feel this, Zara, he whispered, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate lines down her spine. Zara's lips parted, but no words came, because she did feel it. She felt it in the way her heart ached for him, in the way her body craved his touch. But she also felt something else, something dangerous, something that whispered, once you give in, there's no escape. Damien's lips hovered near her ear, his breath hot, teasing. Stay, he commanded softly. Stay with me. Zara swallowed hard, because she knew, if she stayed there was no turning back. Not from this, not from him. But hadn't she already lost the battle? Hadn't she already surrendered the moment she let him kiss her? The moment she let him own her? Zara closed her eyes, her entire body trembling. Damien waited, watched, owned every single second of her hesitation, and then she exhaled, and nodded. Damien's smirk was slow, victorious. He tilted her chin up, capturing her lips in a kiss so deep, so consuming, it left her breathless. You're mine now, he whispered against her lips. Zara's heart stopped, because she knew, he meant it, and she had no idea what she had just gotten herself into. Zara had surrendered. The moment she nodded, the moment her lips met Damien's in that intoxicating possessive kiss, she knew she had sealed her fate. She was no longer just his maid, no longer just a woman in his house, she was his, and that realization sent a dangerous thrill down her spine. Yet, deep inside, something twisted, a whisper of doubt, a flicker of fear, because Damien Knight wasn't an ordinary man. He wasn't someone who loved softly, he loved like a storm, fierce, consuming, impossible to escape, and Zara was beginning to feel like she was caught in the eye of it. That morning, she didn't leave his room. Damien wouldn't let her, not that she even wanted to. She lay in his massive bed, wrapped in his silk sheets, watching as he stood by the window, his phone pressed to his ear. The sunlight spilled over his bare chest, highlighting every sculpted muscle, every hard line of his body. He was the definition of power, and he was hers. When he turned, his piercing gaze locked onto her. His call ended without a word. Good, he murmured, striding back toward the bed. You're still here. Zara's breath hitched as he sat beside her, brushing his fingers over her cheek. Where else would I be? She whispered. His jaw clenched, his thumb traced over her lower lip, his touch possessive. Nowhere, he said darkly. Because you're not leaving me, Zara. Not now, not ever. A shiver ran down her spine. The way he said it, so absolute, so final, should have scared her. But instead her body betrayed her, leaning into his touch, craving more. Damien smirked, as if he could read her thoughts. He tilted her chin up, his lips barely brushing hers. You're mine, he murmured. Say it. Zara's heart pounded. Everything in her screamed, to resist, to hold on to the last sliver of control she had left. But Damien had already unraveled her, and so she gave him what he wanted. I'm yours, she whispered. The effect was instant. Damien growled, pulling her onto his lap, crashing his lips onto hers, in a kiss so deep, so consuming, it stole the air from her lungs. His hands roamed over her, claiming, owning, branding. Zara moaned against his lips, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body melting into him. This wasn't love. This was obsession, and she was drowning in it. Later that day Zara should have known things would change, that Damien wouldn't just let her be. The first sign was when she tried to leave his room. Where are you going? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. To work, she said softly. The other maids will notice. You're not a maid anymore. He cut her off. Zara frowned, but Damien cupped her face, his eyes dark with possession. I don't want you working for me, he said. I want you with me. Her breath hitched. But you belong here, in my room, in my bed, he murmured. Not scrubbing floors, not serving guests. Zara swallowed. She had spent years working hard, making her own way in life, holding on to her independence. And now, in the span of one night, Damien was taking it all away. His fingers curled around her waist, pulling her close. "You don't need to worry about anything anymore," he whispered against her skin. But that was the problem, because worrying was all she could do. Damien Knight wasn't offering her freedom. He was offering her a cage. A beautiful, intoxicating, inescapable cage. And the most terrifying part, she wasn't sure she wanted to escape. Zara sat by the enormous window of Damien's penthouse, gazing at the city skyline that stretched endlessly before her. The world outside was moving, pulsing with life, yet she felt like she was trapped in a world that belonged to only one man, Damien. The man who had set her heart on fire. The man who had claimed her in ways she never thought possible. The man who was slowly, deliberately, dangerously taking over her life. She should have felt happy. She had never been worshipped like this before. Never felt so desired, so needed, so completely consumed. And yet something inside her whispered that this wasn't love. This was possession. And it was tightening its grip around her like an invisible chain. That morning she had tried to reclaim a piece of herself. "Damien, I want to work," she had said, standing in front of him, determined, defiant. His reaction had been instant. A dark shadow passed over his face, his jaw clenching, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup he held. "You don't have to," he said simply, finality dripping from his words. "But I want to," she insisted. "I need to. I need to." His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "Tell me, Zara, what is it that you need? Money?" He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Security. Another step. A place to live." Her breath hitched as he reached her, tilting her chin up with his firm, possessive grip. "You have all of that. I've given you everything. What more do you need?" Zara's heart pounded. He was so close. Too close. "You can't just take away my independence," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew how weak the words sounded. Damien's smirk was slow, dangerous. "Can't I?" Her pulse skipped, because that was the problem. He could, and he was. That night she lay in bed beside him, tangled in the silk sheets that now felt more like shackles than luxury. Damien's arm was wrapped around her waist, his grip firm, unyielding, as if even in sleep, he refused to let her go. His possessiveness should have terrified her, but it didn't. It thrilled her. It made her feel special, irreplaceable. But deep inside, the smallest, quietest part of her knew the truth. She was losing herself, and she didn't know if she would ever get herself back. Zara could feel it, the shift, the way Damien watched her, the way his grip on her waist never loosened, even in sleep, the way he spoke her name, not just with love, but with ownership. She had never known a man like him, and maybe that's what terrified her the most. Because Damien Knight wasn't just a lover, he was a storm, unstoppable, unrelenting. And Zara, she was caught in the middle of it, with nowhere to run. That morning, she woke up to his touch. His fingers skimmed across her bare skin, slow, lazy, possessive. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the way he made her feel, like she was something precious, something he would never let go. "Good morning, sweetheart," he murmured, his lips brushing against her shoulder. Zara sighed, eyes fluttering shut. "Morning," he chuckled, low and deep. "You sound tired. I wonder why." A blush crept up her neck. Because last night had been unlike anything she had ever known. Damien had touched her, like she was his oxygen, had kissed her like she was his salvation, had whispered her name, like a promise, a vow, a curse, and she had fallen. Deeper, harder, too far to turn back. But when she tried to leave the bed, Damien's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "Where are you going?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Zara hesitated. "I thought I'd go downstairs. Maybe have breakfast in the dining room today." A pause. A slow, deliberate pause. "You don't like it here?" he asked, voice dangerously soft. Her stomach twisted. "Of course I do," she said quickly. "I just..." Damien sat up, pulling her against his chest, his arms wrapped around her like a cage. warm and unbreakable. You don't have to go anywhere, Zara, he murmured, his lips tracing her jawline. Everything you need is right here, with me. Her breath hitched. His words should have soothed her, but instead they felt like a chain, wrapping around her heart, because she wasn't sure if Damien was loving her or trapping her. Later that day, Zara sat in the massive living room, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city was alive, bustling with movement, with freedom, and yet she had never felt so caged. Damien had given her the world, luxury, security, passion, but he had taken something too. Her choices, her freedom. Her phone buzzed beside her. She picked it up, frowning when she saw the message. Unknown number. Are you okay? Do you need help? Zara's heartbeat stopped. Her hands trembled as she reread the message, a cold fear settling in her stomach. Who was this? And more importantly, did she need help? She wasn't sure anymore. Zara stared at the message on her phone. Are you okay? Do you need help? Her fingers trembled as she read the words over and over again, her heart pounding. Who had sent this? And why did it feel like a warning? She glanced over at Damien, who stood near the fireplace, his sharp gaze focused on a business call. Even in the dim light, he looked like a king, untouchable, dangerous, intoxicating. But was he her savior, or her prison? That night, Damien was different. His touch was still possessive, his kisses still burned, but there was something else in his eyes, a storm, like he knew something. Come here, he whispered, pulling her into his lap, his arms wrapped around her like chains of silk, soft, but impossible to break. You've been quiet, he murmured against her skin. Tell me what's on your mind. Zara hesitated. Should she tell him about the message? Should she ask him if he was keeping her here? Would he let her go if she wanted to leave? She already knew the answer. Damien didn't let go of things that were his, and she was his, completely. But then the doorbell rang. Damien's grip on her tightened. Stay here, he ordered, his voice a quiet command. Zara's pulse raced as he walked out of the room, his presence disappearing down the hall. Something told her this wasn't just a visitor. Something told her this was her moment. Her only moment. She didn't think. She ran. Her bare feet barely made a sound as she rushed toward the back exit. Her heart thundered in her chest. Freedom was just beyond that door. But as soon as she reached for the handle, a hand grabbed her wrist. Where do you think you're going, sweetheart? Damien's voice was calm. Too calm. Zara's breath caught as he turned her around, his dark, unreadable eyes pinning her in place. For the first time she was truly afraid. You were going to leave me, he said softly, tilting his head. After everything. Tears stung her eyes. Damien, he whispered, brushing his thumb over her trembling lips. You don't have to say anything. I already know. Her heart stopped. He knew. He always knew. Tell me, Zara, he murmured, his grip tightening. Did you really think I'd ever let you go? A shiver ran down her spine, because deep inside, she had always known the answer. Damien Knight didn't lose things he loved, and he loved her. Wildly, madly, dangerously. You're mine, he whispered, pulling her into his arms. And this time, Zara didn't resist. Because love, even when it was a beautiful cage, was still love. And she had already given him everything.